Welcome back to part 2 of this lecture on Goffman's frame analysis. Let's explore the second half of this book a bit, shall we? I hope you enjoy the rest of this lecture. Okay, so Goffman defines out-of-frame activity as any activity that is subordinate to the main activity. Within a given frame, there is a main plot, so to speak, but there are also other things going on in the background or on the side. Goffman provides some definitions running this activity, starting with what he calls disattending. Now, when you disattend a situation, this means that you ignore a significant shift in the frame and just pretend that nothing has changed. For example, you might be working in a team when suddenly the fire alarm goes off. Now, if you all just keep working, assuming that it's just a false alarm, this is disattending that potential shift in the frame. A creature release refers to physiological activity within a frame. This includes, for example, yawning, farting, burping, scratching, sleeping, or bad breath, among others. Usually these kinds of activities lead to embarrassment, as we already learned in the presentation of self in everyday life. Connectives are cues that signal whose turn it is to speak. Examples of connectives might include nodding or raising one's eyebrows at someone as if to say, "Your turn." Evidential boundaries refer to barriers to perception in a frame. This obviously includes everything that's happening outside a frame, or the outside as it was called in the presentation of self, but also everything that happens secretly within a frame. Experience refers to the ability to cope with sudden disruptions to a frame. Someone with experience, according to Goffman, is adept at saving the show when it goes wrong and getting that frame back on track. Usually this involves some degree of effective improvisation. Fishy looks are cues from the audience about how the performance is going. These cues can range from, for example, anger or boredom or disattending or confusion, etc. Finally, Goffman highlights the importance of participant status in interactions. Thus, some actors have more power and capability than others within a frame. For example, if everyone speaks English in a group except for one person, then the foreigner is at an interactional disadvantage and thus has a lower participant status. Bosses have status and authority over employees, and professors over students. In other words, frames are usually characterized by some degree of inequality, according to Goffman. Okay, let's take a look at an example of both disattending and participant status. Once again, we turn to Seinfeld, which provides a wealth of dramaturgical material for us to use. Now, in these scenes, you'll see Costanza quit his job, realize he's made a mistake, and then he tries to return to work as if nothing had happened. So this is him attempting to disattend a significant shift in the frame. Have a look.
That's it. This is it. I'm done. Through. It's over. I'm gone. Finished. Over. I will never work for you again. Look at you. You think you're an important man? Is that what you think? You're nothing. You have no brains, no ability, nothing. I quit. How you doing?
What are you doing here?
What? I work here.
I thought you quit.
What, quit? Who quit?
Bill, how was your weekend?
Oh, excellent weekend. What about your weekend?
Fine weekend.
Yeah, good weekend.
Went up to the Cape, took the kids sailing. Lisa was a little scared at first. That kid's going to be a good sailor someday.
Oh, she's going to be a fine sailor.
Ava, what happened to you Friday afternoon?
Oh, I got tied up.
I'll bet you did. I want to remind everyone that the 10th anniversary party for Rick Barr Properties is going to be Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock in Lasky's Bar in Madison 48th. I want all of you to be there. This really means a lot to me. Is that Costanza over there? What are you doing here?
What?
Am I crazy? Or didn't you quit?
When?
Friday.
Oh, what, Dad? Are you kidding? I didn't quit. Why, you took that seriously.
You mean laughing stock, all that stuff?
Come on, will you stop it?
No brains, no ability?
Teasing. What?
Okay. I want you out of here.
I don't know where you're getting this from. You're serious, aren't you? Oh, you see, you don't know my sense of humor. I mean, Dan, don't I joke around all the time?
I wouldn't say all the time.
You can't win. You can't beat me. That's why I'm here and you're there. Because I'm a winner. I'll always be a winner. And you'll always be a loser.
Now, this is an interesting concept. At least I think it's interesting. So we've seen in frame analysis that life is essentially like a movie that's constantly being filmed with continuous takes and scenes. In this way, framed activity is embedded into ongoing reality. So Goffman argues that we can separate these takes or scenes using what he calls brackets. Brackets can be defined as the temporal and spatial boundaries of a frame. Now, Goffman borrowed this idea from mathematics, where we know that brackets are commonly used to isolate strips of calculations. A run is a strip of activity between the brackets. So when a scene opens, it runs for a while, then it closes, and then another scene opens. For example, right now I'm sitting in my office recording this lecture. This run of activity is surrounded by brackets demarcating the point at which I started and the point at which I am to finish the activity. Now, assuming during this lecture I have to get up and use the toilet, a new scene would begin, right, as I walk down the hallway to the restrooms. Right, so this is our lives, according to Goffman. One scene after the other, separated by brackets. And confusingly, there are also internal brackets within wider brackets. For example, I might be recording this lecture, and then I get interrupted for a moment, and then I go back to recording the lecture again. According to Goffman, each bracket prescribes a different type of behavior, thus determining our social identities and biographies. Bracketed activity also requires what Goffman calls resource continuity, meaning that you must have the same props and materials through different strips of activity. Let's talk a bit about ordinary troubles. Now, straight activity is defined as activity when everyone basically agrees what's going on. As I said before, we like straight activity because everyone's on the same page in terms of understanding each other's behavior. But occasionally there are disagreements about what's going on. This is what Goffman refers to as ordinary troubles. Now, illusions are misframings that are unintentional. This might involve, for example, someone with a psychotic mental illness fostering a false reality. For most people, the plane might simply just be landing, but for one person, the plane might be seen as crashing. Ambiguity refers to uncertainty in the construction of a frame. So this kind of ambiguity is much more common than unintentional illusions. An unexplained crime scene is a classic example of ambiguity. Who committed the crime and how did they commit it? Or maybe you're sitting in your car and driving along and you hear a police siren. Your heart leaps for a moment, but it turns out that the siren is just part of the radio program that you're listening to. Sometimes we claim ambiguity to get out of trouble. For example, you get caught stealing something from a store, you might try to pretend that the product accidentally or somehow just ended up in your bag, right? You don't know how, but somehow it mysteriously ended up there. Errors in framing refer to misperceptions in what's going on and interactional mistakes. Now, these happen occasionally as well. For example, a nurse might try to feed a patient only to find out that he's dead. Or you might see the cops chasing someone, and so you trip the guy, but it turns out that they were just filming a movie. It wasn't real. Or someone pulls a gun on you and you think it's just a joke, but in fact it is real. Or a television show ends and you hear the announcer swear, thinking that the microphone is turned off, as we saw a few lectures ago. When the parties disagree on what's going on, they enter into a dispute, sometimes a legal dispute. And once the dispute has been mediated or resolved, then the frame can be said to be cleared. Now everyone agrees what's going on. For example, an employee might file a discrimination grievance, but after a thorough investigation, it turns out that it wasn't discrimination after all. It was all just one big misunderstanding. So then everyone moves on with this new understanding of the scene. Now, frames, of course, are vulnerable and easily broken. We put a lot of effort into their construction, but they can be shattered in an instant, as we've already learned. A frame break refers to a break in governance that confuses the actors involved. Let's say you're eating lunch one day with your colleague and a plane crashes into the building next door. That would obviously disrupt your frame, which is a scene of you having lunch. Or say you're giving a presentation at work and you have a heart attack. Now clearly the frame would be broken. Now, according to Goffman, there are two possible responses to a frame break. First, internal brackets can be used as a sort of timeout. Imagine, for example, an opera singer who croaks in the middle of a singing performance. She may momentarily stop the performance to get a drink of water, hence the internal brackets. Second, a frame break might cause a downward spiral of inappropriate behavior. For example, the opera singer is singing, she croaks, one person in the audience begins to laugh, then everyone else starts laughing, right? So at this point, the performance is said to be broken. Flooding out refers to a momentary loss of control in social interaction. Sometimes we get really angry or sad or giggly. These actions can clearly disrupt the frame. At this point, Goffman returns to the concept of keying once again. Down keying refers to when playful behavior becomes serious or out of hand. Imagine a sports announcer who gets carried away by a magnificent play. He might say something inappropriate at the end of it like, "Wow, look at that son of a bitch go." Upkeying is the opposite. This is when serious behavior becomes playful. For example, you might be watching a serious part in a movie. I remember one time when I watched the movie A Few Good Men in the movie theaters, there was a very dramatic part where Jack Nicholson says, "You're goddamn right I did," something like that. And when he said that in the movie, it was a very dramatic period in the film, and one member of the audience went, "Oh shit," really loudly, and then the whole audience started to laugh. Right, so this would be an example of upkeying. Rekeying refers to when an activity transforms or morphs in some way. Now, this is a little bit more of an abstract concept, but bear with me. Imagine two actors who are filming a scene for a movie when they both burst into laughter. Now, these two actors later appear on a talk show, and the deleted scene is shown where they both burst into laughter. Once again, the two actors on the talk show burst into laughter. The talk show host then begins to laugh, the audience begins to laugh, and the people at home watching begin to laugh. Right? So this is an example of how an activity, the original activity, can be rekeyed and re-rekeyed and re-re-rekeyed, etc., etc. So let's take a look at a clip demonstrating a classic frame break. Once again, surprise, surprise, we return to Seinfeld, where we see Elaine flooding out as a result of a misplaced Pez dispenser. Have a look.
I don't know how anyone does this. This must be so nerve-wracking. How do they warm up their fingers?
They have a piano backstage they warm up on.
No, we would have heard it.
What do you think? They just crack their knuckles and come out?
I told her we'd all go out afterwards, okay?
Sure.
And don't applaud when she stops playing the first time it's not over yet.
Who said that? That's directed at me, isn't it? Is this okay? Can I do this?
Let's talk about the manufacture of what Goffman calls negative experience. Now, some frame breaks are fairly minor and they don't disrupt the overall experience. Think, for example, of an American football game when the team temporarily huddles together to solidify its game plan. Technically, this is a break in the frame, but it's not one that dramatically disrupts the frame. If, however, the football team huddled together for 30 minutes, now this would be a significant frame break that produces a negative experience for everyone involved. When a significant frame break occurs, the frame itself becomes fluttered or blurred, or sometimes entirely unsustainable. For example, think about the Taiwanese parliament when it descends into a fistfight, halting the work of the chamber. Or think about an employee who's brutally humiliated at work, so much so that he can't even bring himself to return. Or consider the example of an eminent scientist who is suddenly found out to be a fraud. The frame surrounding her career is suddenly decimated. Frames can also be disrupted by heckling. This is when a member of the audience disrupts the performance. They can also be disrupted through confrontation. This is when there is an open frontal attack on the ground rules of a social occasion. These open frontal attacks almost inevitably lead to negative experience on the part of all actors involved in the frame. It should not be surprising to learn that all social interaction is vulnerable to disruption, either through unintentional mistakes or through intentional assaults on the integrity of the frame. Zero-sum interactions are particularly vulnerable. This would include, for example, wage bargaining, where one party to the interaction benefits at the expense of another. But really, all interactions or frames are fragile. They are full of ambiguity, mutual distrust, and an imperfect ability to predict others' behaviors. We think we know each other's intentions, and sometimes we do, but other times we don't, and we misjudge how others will behave or act. When we misjudge, this allows our suspicions to grow. We are, in this modern age especially, constantly on the lookout for fabrications and falsifications. We are ever vigilant to the realities that are presented to us, and often do not simply accept them at face value. I mean, let's face it, we live in a low-trust society, and the trust that we extend to others is increasingly vulnerable. In many situations, especially in retail, we enter them almost expecting to be deceived, right? If you go to buy a car, you know that the salesperson is not likely to be an honest broker. When we find that we have been deceived by a salesperson or a husband or a wife, a friend or a stranger, this leads to a downward spiral of distrust. In many ways, this perfectly describes the social world according to Goffman. The reality we are presented by other people is expected to be contrived. Frames are just a facade. Sometimes they work and we accept them, but other times they just fall apart because they're, well, flimsy. Finally, in the last part of frame analysis, Goffman provides a really interesting overview of the role of talk in social interaction. He argues here that utterances, that is the patterned noises that we make when we speak, are subject to transformations like keyings and fabrications. Language is highly vulnerable to ambiguity. In fact, we often have to ask each other, what do you mean? Because what we say, although it may be clear to us, is not always clear to others. There is, according to Goffman, a disjuncture or a disconnect between our intended meaning, that is what we intend to say to others, and the unintended meaning, which is what others hear when we talk. Misunderstandings are rife in social interaction. Obviously, this holds true in a workplace. A simple compliment from one employee's point of view may be perceived as sexual harassment from another employee's point of view. During the course of natural conversation, we are desperately trying to follow each other, to figure out what we mean, but language is imprecise, and so communication often fails, and sometimes spectacularly. Goffman makes an interesting observation that the word I necessarily invokes personal responsibility. He further argues that we frequently use playful language like I was just kidding to externalize that responsibility when we don't want to take it ourselves. He further observes that effective communication requires suspense when telling a story. The plot, so to speak, of a narrative must be unfolded gradually and suspensefully, lest the audience loses interest in the story. And he also points out that our use of language is rife with what he calls filled pauses, which are pauses in which is the basic sound. Because silence is perceived as uncomfortable. And to hold your place in a conversation whilst you think of your next utterance, we fill our sentences with a lot of ums and ahs, etc., etc. Well, folks, there you have it. I've just summarized Goffman's frame analysis for you. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, you're not expected to read this book. It is, after all, around 700 pages of pretty dense text. But it is a fantastic and insightful framework for thinking about social interaction, and it has clear implications for the social psychology of work, which is why I gave you these lectures. Even though you're not required to read it, you're most welcome to, of course. It is a rewarding experience and one that you will not soon forget, I promise. All right then, that concludes the lecture for week 5. Next week, we're going to continue our exploration of yet another of Goffman's books. This one is called Stigma, and it's a superb piece of research. See you soon.